In this video, we'll continue our discussion of cosine and sine functions and moving them around. What we're going to start working on now are shifts, left and right, and up and down. So in our equation, our vertical shifts will focus on this d here. The horizontal shifts is based on c, if it is there or not. The kicker is, though, it's always c over b. And we have to factor it out. So the value of c over b for a sinusoidal function is called the horizontal shift. Or displacement of a basic sine or cosine. If c is greater than 0, the graph shifts to the left. Actually, the way it's written, because it says minus c, that would be opposite. It's to the right. I'll show you what I mean because this gets a bit confusing. Just like in PreCalc 1, it has the same idea. If c is less than 0, it shifts to the right. Left, sorry, it can't be both, right? I'll show you why that's kind of getting confusing the way that's written. Okay, so the greater value of c, the more the graph is shifted. Okay, so the figure below shows that the graph of, okay, so take a look at this, shifts to the, okay, it's going to be the right. It's the opposite of the sine. So it's a negative pi, so it's opposite by pi units. So take a look at this picture. We have this function, that's our normal function, and then the green function is what we just looked at. It moves the whole dark blue function that's there, and it moves it to the right, pi. So we can see that this point right here moved to this point right here in the green. Right, everything got shifted over to the right. And I'll show you how to do that here in a moment for the best way to graph these. Right? And then in the other function, so we have this now x minus pi over 4, it's shifted to the right because it's a negative, pi over 4 units. So you can see that the orange function here moved my blue function to the right, just pi over 4. All right, that's kind of difficult on a normal graph. So I have a system that helps me with this thing. It's based on this midline that I talked about earlier. So it's like what it goes back and forth across, right? So midline there for that sine function, we can see it. So when we're doing shifts, what I'll do is I'll move the midline. If this plus d on the outside is positive, I move it up. If it's negative, I move it down, just like parabolas and functions that you guys did in PreCalc 1. All right, what we're going to look at now is a few examples, and we're going to determine direction and magnitude of the phase shift, and then in the next video, we'll learn how to graph these. Okay, so determine the direction and magnitude of the phase shift for that function. So I'm just going to rewrite it just because that's how I work. Cosine, and then it's x minus pi over 2. I typically rewrite so I don't miss anything. Okay, this is a, they want the direction. So the direction would be it moves to the right, shifts, we should use the math word, shifts right by pi over 2. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to move this around. Here's my normal. So normal. And this is how I think. Let me straighten that line out and flatten it. Okay, how I think about it is my normal goes from 0 to 2 pi. And it's 0 to pi. This is always going to be pi over 2. And this is always going to be 3 pi over 2. So what I do is if there is no making the period smaller, right? We have nothing in front of here, no b until 1. Then I would use this, and this is how I think about it. 0, pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Those are my quadrantal angles on our unit circle. And I can always graph sine or cosine based on this, right? If I'm doing sine, I would graph on the normal line and go around it like that. On the midline, I mean. And graph just like that. If it was a cosine function, what I would do instead of graphing on the midline, I graph above it. And I follow the pattern that way, giving my cosine function. All right. My new shift, forget my little note there to myself. So we're going to go shift, if I could spell it right, shift pi over 2. So to the right. So all I'm going to do is rewrite my line. And then we're going to graph from this here in a moment. So this is where it's actually going to start. If I have to shift everything to the right, pi over 2, I'm going to add pi over 2 to everything. So pi over 2, I mark my same lines. And all I'm doing is shifting them over. So pi over 2 is going to become pi. Pi, I add pi over 2, I get 3 pi over 2. These are nice little adding. You may have to use a calculator, a common denominator, and all that. This becomes 2 pi. And then if I think about 2 pi, that's 4 pi over 2, so the next one's going to be 5 pi over 2. Now I know if I had to graph cosine, cosine starts off the midline. We're going to do some graphing in a moment, which means I would graph above it, on it, below it, on it, above it, and that would be my graph. Now, given this 3, we know that we'd have to start 3 above it, not just 1 above it like in the past. We're going to get a few examples of this in some problems here in a moment. All right, so let's look at the next one. So the next function, we're answering the same thing. They didn't want the shifts down there on the number lines, but I wanted to go ahead and give you many examples of that. So we'll start here. Now this one, we don't have to adjust the midline, the hard part. All we're going to have to adjust here is that plus 2. So this shifts up 2, which means my midline would no longer be on the x-axis. It would be 2 units up. So when I'm graphing this, right, I have my x1, and then I'd be like, okay, here's 2, and I know the midline is right there. And I would graph my function based around that midline instead of here. It would base around there. We'll get some examples in. All right, so that's all they wanted for that one. This is how we determine shifts. Just like in from the functions, parabolas, and everything in PreCalc 1, the numbers are the same way. They're just going to apply a little different.